Without further ado, the thing that you actually came here to see is Ratan Murty, who's a relatively recent hire at Georgia Tech. Is this your second year?
Yeah.
Okay.
Second year.
I got to be careful because it gets away. Pretty soon I'll be saying that in deck. I've been here for 10 years. But, so he's an assistant professor in the Cognition and Brain Science Unit of the Department of Psychology. And before joining Georgia Tech, he was a postdoc and research scientist at the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines and at the McGovern Institute of Brain Research at MIT, where he worked with Nancy Canwisher and Jim DiCarlo. He received his PhD in neuroscience at the Vision Lab, the Indian Institute of Science. So research in his lab aims to uncover the neural codes and algorithms that support vision, and to do this by integrating the study of biological vision with artificial models, so combining experimental testing in humans, like MRI paradigms, with computational methods to try to develop a more computationally precise understanding of human vision. But he's going to tell you all of that. He probably won't mention that he has recent senior author publications in journals like PNAS and Nature of Human Behavior, so I'll just put that out there. But we're very happy to have him here today, so help me to welcome Dr. Ratan Murty, please.
Well, thank you. Do I need to stay close to the mic? Thanks, it's been so nice to be here. I also actually do want to say that this CMBC has been amazing and also just fostering a community. I've been at their mixers, some of these programs. If you're a graduate student, you're very lucky to have this. Make use of all these opportunities that you have. Okay, cool. So today, actually, I have an agenda, which is to show you some of the new work that we've been doing, in order to both get feedback and also actually seek your participation. Because some of the things that we've been developing are more for the community, and we want to see what the community really needs, and whether or not you will benefit from the efforts that we're trying to build, the stuff that we're doing today. Okay, so the title of my talk is towards executable vision systems for human neuroscience, and I'm going to start really broad and just start with what we think of as the organizational principles of that support intelligence in brains. Right? Now, the one thing that we all know is that cortex in general, and let's take specifically the visual cortex, is highly structured. So what I mean by that is that there are some parts of the brain that seem to be more or less causally involved in few tasks. Things like processing faces, looking at body parts, processing scenes. I know there are a lot of experts here in-house for this kinds of stuff. And the thing to note is that these regions are all present and seem to be, each one of you has this in your brains. They seem to land in the approximate same location, right? And if you're seeing all this, you can think of them as some kinds of building blocks of intelligence. Think of this as, if you have Lego blocks, we know some parts of these Lego systems, right? That's what we call the building blocks of intelligence. Okay, so because this is my first time here giving this talk, so I thought I'll start with just telling you what are the kinds of questions the lab really is interested in. So we span a wide range of topics. The first one is, as Didrik mentioned, what are the neural codes and algorithms? What is the nature of those building blocks that a visual system supports? So we are also interested in trying to understand how those get constructed over development, because do they arrive very early on in life or no? What's the role of visual experience? We were just chatting about the role of blindness. What if you don't have any visual experience with these categories? Now, the more applied part of the stuff that we do is trying to understand what happens when these mechanisms go awry. Think of conditions like prosopagnosia, which is a condition where you can't tell two faces apart. We are trying to figure out whether we can understand these mechanisms better by developing computational models for these things. And the fourth wing is really try to figure out how neural mechanisms, these building blocks, actually interact with your behavior, right? Because for the most part, when we study these parts of the brain, we're talking about the inputs to the system. not the behavioral drivers of those systems. So we're now trying to understand whether we can develop end-to-end models. All right. But the thing that really sets us apart is that when we talk about developing building blocks, we want to combine two aspects of this. The engineering of trying to develop these systems, which means that a mathematically rigorous, computationally, like a compact representation that is a close, if you will, a digital twin of these parts of the human brain. So, which means that what we really want to do is we're seeking explanations that are, really come from engineering, right? And we want to do more science on top of it, right? And that's really the agenda today, because I want to convince you that this approach is the best approach that we have today, or a very promising approach that we have today that we did not have 10 years back. And I think we should all make use of this. Okay, and what that really means is that the community will have to work together on some of these things, because each of us has expertise in one of the many components that will go into developing the new science of intelligence in the future. Okay, so today I'm going to span two big questions. Okay, so my talk really is divided into two parts. The first one is, if I'm going to talk to you about developing computational models, let's ask ourselves, how good are the models that we currently have today at this point in time? Okay? And the second part of my talk is really going to be changing the paradigm slightly and seeing, given all that we know from neuroscience, can we use some of these understandings to improve AI systems, right? Because despite how good we think they are really fragile in ways human intelligence is not, or human systems are not. Okay, so that's really the two parts of the talk that this is going to be the span of my talk. So I'm going to start with a very basic idea, why should we even care? Why do we care about developing computational models of the brain in the first place? Okay, and before that, let me just introduce the cast. So these are the people in my lab who've been actually championing these efforts, right? You can look at them. I mean, they're young people. It's very quickly you can tell, that their backgrounds. But the reason I actually have this slide up mostly is to just make you realize that what you just did by looking at these faces and telling them apart is actually a remarkable feat of biological engineering. I had a really complex slide that I removed at the very last minute because I wanted to show you that in the pixel space, all of these faces look identical, right? So the inputs that is falling on your retina has absolutely no information about all the things that you inferred by just looking at these images, right? And the question is how did you perform this task? And there's a standard answer. One of the ways to do this is you can look at the face processing network in the human brain, extremely well-characterized system. If you don't recognize this brain, that's my brain, the bottom view of my brain, right? And when you see the activations here, that's a typical activation that you will find when you're looking at an image of a human face. People have characterized this region in great detail. This part of the brain is called the fusiform face area. They were actually identified in my previous lab. And if you look at the response of stimuli in this part of the brain, you find a very characteristic pattern. And the pattern is the following. Okay, so on the x-axis here are images, on the y-axis are the responses. You will find that faces have a high response in this part of the brain, okay, compared to the stimuli from any other category. People have tested a number of other categories. Doesn't matter what you present, faces always seem to have the highest response in this part of the brain. Okay, so now you can look at these data and then you would conclude that, okay, this part of the brain is selective to faces. And that's what people have done for the longest part. To me, this is actually just signifies the first step. This kind of inference that you just made, that this part of the brain is face selective, is actually a one-dimensional inference. Because all you just understood is that the response is going to be higher for faces than other things, right? So people call these explanatory models, and this has been, this has been an important first step. It's great because now we have these theories that can span, psychology and cognitive science and philosophy and so on, because faces are important for us. right? But actually, they have a lot of limitations that we should all be at least aware of. So there are at least 3 issues that I'm going to raise. And by the way, like this example with faces is just an example. You can take any of your pet theories and you can put it in. The same principles apply. Okay? So here are the 3 issues in my view. The first issue is that the inference that you just made just underspecifies the richness of the pattern of responses that you actually see when you make measurements from this part of the brain. For example, if you look at these images, there's a very characteristic fall of responses, right? There's a very characteristic fall here. This inference about faces has nothing to do with what actually is happening and cannot explain any of these stable differences, right? All right, so here's a second kind of issue. You always need a human in the loop. If what is a face? It's you interpreting a stimulus and calling it a face. But essentially to your, this part of the brain is a pattern of photoreceptors that are getting activated, and you really want to understand what's driving the responses. If you want to have a full characterization of what goes on in a part of the brain like the FFA, right? Most importantly, it does not make a prediction for any stimulus. I can take a bottle like this, okay, and based on this knowledge that you have, that is selective to faces, I ask you what's the response of this bottle going to be? You have no idea, right? Because that's not we test. All you can say it will be a low response compared to a face. That's it, right? Okay, now this is a more controversial one, right? You can ask this question and say, okay, is category selectivity even true? Right? What does it mean to be category selective? Because it is actually inherently, I call it a reckless hypothesis, because it can very easily be refuted if you find a given category of stimulus, say a set of bottles that have a high response than compared to a face, then this jig is up, right? And this applies again to any category, any of your theories in human cognitive neuroscience. That's what it is today, right? And essentially, you're making an inference of the whole class of stimuli that you can ever encounter by running an experiment based on maybe 100 stimuli at best, if you're lucky, on that particular day, right? So we got to do better. At least we should aspire to do better, right? And I think that's where computational models really come in, right? Because you can get models to at least make accurate predictions that are stimulus computable, which means that you can get them to predict responses to any stimulus, and also interface. This is an important one, right? All of our models will not be helpful if they don't actually make contact with all the knowledge that we have already, received from cognitive science and neuroscience and other fields. Right? Okay, so this was the early motivations. And for a while, I think we did not have very good models. Right? So it made sense for us to actually come up with hypotheses based on the literature, because that's what we did for a long while. But then everything changed, right? We have all these AI algorithms now that are really, really powerful. They look like a hot mess, right? They have all these layers. Think of them as hierarchies in the brain, and so on. We'll return to this. But actually, they are also good models of the human brain. What we can do, and this is not the very first. This is one way of doing it. What you can do is you can run stimuli through the human brain. You can run stimuli through many, neural network models. You can extract features from this model, and depending on your favorite mapping method, you can map that to the brain, and you can get the models to be really, really accurate. So how accurate? So this is how you typically test the accuracy of a given model. On the x-axis here is the predicted response. On the y-axis here is the observed response. So the model's never seen any of the stimuli here, okay? They're just trying to make a prediction based on the way they've been trained. And so at the time, this was pretty good, right? What you have seen here is, so these blue things indicate the responses of faces in the FFA. So now suddenly what you can do is you can predict the stable pattern of differences within the FFA, but also for all other stimuli, okay? And it's not only related to the FFA, you can take other parts of the brain. So this is a region that's called the PPA. I've not introduced the PPA, but I know Danny works on the PPA to some degree, right? and the OPA. So it's a scene-selective region, responds more to stimuli containing scenes and other categories. And here's the response of the EBA, which is a part of the brain that responds more to body parts than other conditions. Okay, really good. You can get these models to be really, really accurate. So we can predict responses with high accuracy, but now you can ask, okay, now that we have a model, what can we learn about the brain, right? Because in the end of the day, like, we got into this business because we wanted to learn something about the human brain, right? That's why we are here. Okay, so
it's me. Go back. Is blue preferred?
Yes.
So it's face here.
It's face here, scenes here, and bodies here.
EBA. Why are those numbers less for the preferred than the non-preferred?
The numbers here are less for preferred and non-preferred because the amount of variance, the overall amount of variance, because you have more number of stimuli, is higher for the non-preferred categories.
You had
than
more
for the
non-preferred
preferred
stimuli? Is that what
yeah, like you have a bunch of stimuli
so
which
if
you
you
can
have the same number of
partition.
preferred as non-preferred, that correlation would be similar.
That is right.
Okay.
And we've actually tested that as well.
Okay.
Okay, so one thing that you can do is you can take your model and put that under the microscope, right? Because having an image computable model gives you access to all the internal features that you do not have, you actually cannot just get from the human brain, right? So we asked a few questions. The first question that you can ask is, okay, can you, like, without knowing the feature preference for that part of the brain, can you reverse engineer the selectivity? Okay, so that's one of the questions. So the way to do that is, some amount of engineering. What you can do is you can take a model of the brain, which is the stuff that I was telling you about, and then you can append that into some kind of generative AI model. Back in 2021, they were called GANs, right? Now you have stable diffusion and all the new stuff that's coming out. It does not really matter because once you run this algorithm through, the kinds of stimuli that they generate are things that look very much like a human face, right? So the models, I know they're out of nightmares, but this is just because, it's a GAN and, all this kind of noise in the stimulus, but you can get very, very nice face-looking things. So now you can do stuff that you could not do before, right? You can do to, like, say, go to other parts of the human brain that you know nothing about, and you can reverse engineer, like, what is the stimulus that this part of the brain likes, right? Again, this is a superpower that you did not have before. Okay, now you can ask a more precise version of this question, right? Which is, I know that this part of the brain responds to faces, but what is it about the face that you really like, right? Like, what is the feature dependence of the fusiform face area to some of these stimuli? So here's an experiment that you can very easily run. This is the classic reverse correlation approach. Easy to do this with monkeys, impossible to do this with humans because we need like 5,000 images or so. And then you can run that particular stimulus through, and what you get at the end is like a single feature that seems to be driving the response in the fusiform face area. And we know from a lot of prior work that the feature dependence of the fusiform face area are eyes, right? The eyes and the nose part, which you can just reverse engineer by taking a model and running the experiment on the model. Okay? All right, so this is what I've told you so far. This is old news at this point, 2021. So we have NeuroAI models from human vision that can predict the brain with very high accuracy. And they can also be very helpful. You can use it to reverse engineer the selectivity, which is what I showed you. It can also tell you the feature preference of brain regions. You can actually also use it to directly modulate brain responses, right? People have shown this with monkeys. We've done this same kind of experiment with humans, and they're already giving you abilities that you do not have. Okay, so that's the setup. So here's the question: like, are we done? Do we just know everything about the FFA? How do we know if we are ever done? Right. So that's where the field is, I think, at this point in time. We know that given a single data set, we can build good models, but we don't really know whether those models actually will stand to the test of everything that we know about these parts of the brain. Okay, now simultaneously you have a bunch of these other papers that pretty much will claim that neural networks are not good models of the brain, right? Now, I am the first to admit that the way we are evaluating models right now is completely broken. right? This is not how we should be testing models, like one given data set at a time, using different methods. There's absolutely no consistency in the field. Some people like RDM, some people use encoding models, and there are pretty passionate debates on both sides. This to me is actually a very dangerous one because we don't know what the limits of our current approaches are. I call them bounds. So even Newtonian mechanics has bounds, right? Like a big part of developing models is to know where they're going to start to fail, and we have absolutely no idea in human neuroscience. Okay, so now here's the proposition. Ultimately, if these models are any good, they should explain or predict everything that we know about these brain regions. So in the extreme, okay, this is a very cartoonish version. Like there's a part of the brain that each one of us has that I'm claiming that is running on my laptop, right? So that should sound ridiculous to you. Like if it isn't, then it's a problem, right? So how can we test how good our models are, right? So I'm actually trying to propose a different solution. So we're going to call this, we're calling this internally within the lab, like trying to develop like a project virtual cortex, right? Now, this is work that is led by Alex, a postdoc in the lab, Roland and Mayuk. So the central idea is the follows. Like, how well do these models recapitulate the previously published results? Like, I don't know what we're going to get in the future, but we have all this literature, like from these parts of the brain that have been published. So let's do that. Okay, so that's the strategy that we're trying to adopt right now. So here is a general recipe for how this will work. You take your published results from the field, easy, go on PubMed, type fusiform face area, you get like 20,000 citations, right? What you can do now is you can try to run those exact experiments, but this time on the model of the brain. Okay? And simple, like let's chronicle like how many times we succeed, and let's chronicle every time we fail. Okay, so that's the general idea. So we have these three models, and we're going to call them the virtual FFA, that's VFFA. And we're going to run these experiments on these virtual bits of cortex, right? Now, there are two kinds of comparisons that you can do. I'm going to call some of them qualitative comparisons and the others quantitative comparisons, and it'll be clear what these things are in a minute, right? So let's look at some qualitative comparisons. So here this is like just a small snapshot of things that we know about the fusiform face area. Like we know things like they have center bias and animacy bias, this thing called like holistic face processing and so on. A bunch of experiments that have been done on the fusiform face area. And the question is like, why should we even expect failures? Right? Like why do we think that our models will not be able to capture the responses from some of these experiments and not the ones that we actually tested them on, which are those naturalistic looking images from ImageNet or whichever data set, right? All right, I'm at Emory, so I couldn't resist, so I took a paper from Danny's lab. So this is a paper that's called Face is More Than the Eyes, Nose and Mouth, right? This was run by Freddie, a friend of mine. Really smart experiment, okay? Like look at how smart this experiment is. So you take the internal features of the face, and you take the external features of the face, right? And you contrast that against two other control categories, if you will, objects and scenes, right? And you ask, okay, does the FFA respond more to the internal features or the external features, right? You make measurements from the brain. Here's figure 2 from their paper. What you find is that the FFA responds more to the internal features, followed by the external features, I think pretty similar responses, compared to these other two categories. That's the paper, okay? Let's take the same images, run them through the model of the brain. By the way, this kind of stimulus the model's never seen. Not seen it when the model's being trained, never seen when we were building these models. So these are zero-shot tests. You build it, you evaluate it. That's it, okay? You run that on the model of the brain, here's what you find.
Oh, thank God.
Okay. Pretty similar responses, right? You get this exact same pattern. So based on this, you can, by the way, evaluate many model architectures, and you'll find that actually it breaks a few of these models. I mean, like a model trained only on faces is not a good model to do this kind of stuff, right? Previous studies can help tell us the difference between models, right? This is a new use of all the data that we've already published in the field. Okay, here's another experiment. This is from Chris Baker's lab. I want to give you another experiment which comes from a multivariate test. Just to tell you that it's not just the average response in the FFA that matters, right? So this is a condition. This is a perceptual phenomenon that's called face pareidolia, everybody's probably seen this. So this is this ability of you see like faces in everyday objects, right? Like hopefully all of you can see a face here. If not, talk to me. And then you can compare them against objects, or you have these other human faces. Okay. So the analysis that they do here is a decoding analysis. By the way, the y-axis here should be decoding accuracy, which I don't know why it's not showing up. Maybe it will be in a minute. If you know what decoding is, great. Then if not, this is all that matters. If this number is close to 50%, it means it's a chance. You cannot discriminate between these categories. If the number is higher, it means that you can. Okay? Here's the pattern that you get in the brain. It's complicated to read, so I just created an animation here. What this result really shows is that illusory faces are closer to objects for the FFA than they are to human faces. Okay, so within the FFA, these two have more similar response compared to a human face than the illusory face to a human face. That's the pattern. Okay? All right. You run this experiment on the model of the FFA, what do you expect to find? We found the same pattern. Okay? The y-axis here is, by the way, decoding accuracy is much higher, right? It goes up to 100 because the data that we train these models on was really, really good. And the y-axis really depends on the signal-to-noise ratio when you are measuring fMRI. Okay. All right. So we took all of these other papers.
Is it the same models?
Yeah, it's the same, exact same model.
But are the ones that are performing best comparable across?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, I did not show you that. I mean, it's a huge table. It gets complicated. So we thought we'll let that be here. Okay, so we can take all of these publications and we can see if we run them and we find any mistakes, right? Nope. All of these phenomena can be replicated today on our current model of the face regions, right? So that's pretty good. And around the same time, we had these other data sets come in. This is a very famous one now. It's called natural scenes data set. 76,000 stimuli. And
Sorry,
from 8 different subjects.
One other question.
Yeah.
What makes it a good model of the face? I know you said that training on faces alone doesn't. What's the architecture and training like?
So I can tell you. So we have characterized the hell out of it. Like we can tell you like exactly what goes into building all of these models. There are some top level recipes. Don't train it only on faces. You need to train them on other categories as well. So that's like number one. Language supervision seems to help. Okay, so when you have a vision language model that's trained both on language and vision.
Is that the clip one?
It is actually a Dino V2.
Okay.
So it's not exactly clip, but this one is a slightly different architecture. Clip does really well, by the way, on these particular tasks as well.
Not on the first one you showed.
It does actually.
Not on Danny's.
Oh, so that was mean squared error, so lower is better.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have clarified that. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a really good model. Now, there are other aspects that we can talk about as well. Like we can remove parts, like we can remove like which specific training error, and that's all work in progress. So let's move on and talk about the natural scenes datasets. So these are, by the way, like I call them qualitative datasets because we're not exactly measuring the magnitude of the responses, even though we tried.
John, one more question.
Yes, please. No, this is good. Stella, keep it going.
But
Yeah.
what about developmental data?
Yeah.
Are the models as good with the
Yeah.
infant data?
Yes, they are. So
okay.
we did this work with actually Freddie and Rebecca Sachs,
Yeah.
where they characterized the development of the scene selective regions, I believe, across when kids were watching this movie of, I want to call them partly cloudy. I think that was the animation video.
Mm-hmm.
It's a publicly available data set. Mm-hmm. And my contribution to that paper really was to see whether we can get a model to recapitulate the time course of the entire movie. It does a really, really good job.
Okay.
Now,
and is it the same models again that are?
yeah, it's pretty much the same models.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a clip one is doing better for
Yes.
the babies.
Yeah. But I don't think that's a good test of development. Let me clarify that. It's a good test of inference of the model, not a good test of development. And there should be, we can talk about what the differences are. Okay, the natural series data set. Here's the bottom line that probably we should care about. Different scanner, different subject, different images. Models never seen these images, never trained on these images, right? So we said, okay, let's see how well the models can predict these data without ever seeing it, right? It's the same approach. So here's what we did. We estimated the noise ceiling of the data, which unfortunately, this is a bad choice of color here. This is a gray, thing here that you cannot see at this point, which is this. By the way, we are now calling the NeuroAI Turing test idea, which is the fact that you want to estimate the similarity of two human beings, right? And then you want to evaluate whether the models are pretty much like us or something else, and not evaluate it against say the noise ceiling of the data themselves. All right. I suggest checking out that paper if you have questions on that. Now, here's the model performance relative to the ceiling. Without ever seeing any of these data, we are extremely close. We're almost at the level of two human beings on this task, right? And this is another way of looking at these models, and you can evaluate the models on more quantitative terms.
Wait, dude, what is that? That's prediction across the 1,000 images.
Across the shared 1,000 images that all the subjects saw.
Okay.
We've done this on individuals as well, but we don't have those ceiling estimates for you.
Okay.
So which is why I'm not presenting them.
So is this still for the face area, or is this a more?
We've done this for, at this point, like 10 different areas. I'm showing you just faces for now so that it's easier to parse through the stock. But a larger number of areas in the brain. All right. So what we can do now, once I change these slides, is, you can compare a large number of models, again, bad choice of color, on a number of architectures. This is a kind of question that Stella was asking me about, against the human-to-human ceiling. That's how good we want the models to be. And you find like there is a large gradation between models. Whereas if you had done the old approach, which is you take the models on NSD and train and test it on an NSD, the same data set, you don't see the models changing a lot. So the current inference that you find in the field, like all models look alike, is because you're training it on the same data set and evaluating it on the same data set, right? So this is a stronger way of even evaluating models, is the point that I'm trying to make. And we can also go through a lot of these qualitative data sets and show you like there are a number of tasks that these models cannot do even today. But the goal, the top level thing that I want you to take away is that we can now use all the cognitive science experiments that people have performed already on these parts of the brain to tell apart, all the different computational models that people have been building. And the goal is that we want to move towards a unified explanation, like a single model that can capture a number of these phenomena without ever having to train on those things from scratch, right? So that's what we want to move towards, right? And in some sense, we also want to retire all the experiments that we know all models do well on, right? What's the point of having benchmarks and data sets that are too easy, right? Identify the things that models are not good at and then expose them and try to do better on those particular sets of images. Okay. The most exciting thing here is that we want to make all of this executable. What that means is that you can try it yourself, right? You can choose whatever part of the brain that you like, the model architecture that you like, and the training images if you want to evaluate that. And we are calling this framework the idea of the virtual visual cortex. And it's an executable platform where you'll be able to simulate your prior experiments and indeed a future experiment. Like if you have a hypothesis about a part of the brain, this is something that my students do in class all the time. They'll ask me a question about, how does the human FFA respond to an image of a Picasso painting, right? And I'm like, go test it, right? I can at least tell you what our current best explanation of that part of the brain is, instead of me having to guess, right? You can simulate your future experiments directly today on these models that we are putting up on this particular framework. And we have 3 goals in our mind. We want to actually have a single framework where we can organize all models and all data in one place. We want to be able to test new hypotheses directly on models, and even for access and teaching, right? We want to make it available to the public for them to break. I mean, of course, this is people who are working at OpenAI obviously think that ChatGPT is pretty good, right? Only when you give it out to the world, you start figuring out what the issues are. And we want to make a platform where people can tell us where models are breaking. That's the goal. Tell us where we fail. All right? That's the general idea. So we have a couple of publications in the works. As I said, we want to lay bare the strengths and the limitations of these methods. We want to amplify experiments that break current models and encourage them, right? Like run experiments that models are not performing well on. And this, you can think of this as a digital twin to test your hypotheses. We supply the GPUs. If you're interested, reach out. We have a version of this already working. We can give you a number of brain regions already if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Okay, so let's summarize this first part. I think what I'm trying to convince you is that the models that we have today are better than anything. It's better than human intuition. It's really good at predicting a large number of experiments in the field, right? So maybe you have a smart next experiment you want to run, but even so, you should test your hypotheses on these models first. We are at that stage already. Okay, they predict a lot, they explain a lot. I introduced this idea of the virtual visual cortex. This is what I think of it. It's like the first building blocks. I'll just finish this part in it. And the good thing is that this is also a scalable thing, right? You can extend it to other parts of cognition. We're already talking about doing this in audition and doing it for language. And we think of this as also inputs to the post-perceptual systems, right? Like, so once we have a good first pass understanding of the perceptual system, we want to try other things in the future, and we're having a good conversation about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what your definition of explanation is, because for physicists it would be the reduction of a complex system to principles or equations or concepts that you can understand, the coding principles, for instance, and not just a mesh of connections in a neural network.
Yeah.
So how do you extract explanation? I understand prediction and stuff like that and replication, but
at the moment I'm talking about like understanding from a human, like the human cognitive neuroscience perspective, which is that the dependence of stimulus and a set of responses that you get in the brain. You are right. We are doing the same thing here as well. We want to reduce the complexity of the models and make them simpler. That probably I'm going to show you a version of that in part 2 of my talk, right? Like these models, I mean, obviously the current AI systems are not how the human brain has been trained, but they are sufficiently good basis set. That's the level at which we have we have models in the human cognitive system, right? That said, there's this other enterprise of human cognitive neuroscience that cares about running different hypotheses on these parts of the brain. They are also important if you want to understand, perceptual disorders, like what happens in color blindness, what happens in prosopagnosia, and stuff like that. That's where we are today. They're too complex even for my own liking. We're working on making them simpler for you as well. All right, so let's move to part 2 of my talk. Do I have enough time? Let's see, 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So in this part of the talk, I want to change sort of tracks a little bit and ask a different kind of question. How can we use neuroscience to improve current AI systems, right? And to do that, let's go back to these things that we call AI today, right? Some of you might recognize this. They're broadly 2 kinds of major classes of architectures. There are variations, okay, but for the most part, you can think of this like a hierarchical set. So you have these convolutional networks on one hand, you have these new age transformers on the other hand, which are a completely different principle, right? And you might wonder, okay, what do the internals of these models look like, right? So let's look at some of the internals. So what we're showing you here is like an internal activation of a well-known model. It's called a ResNet 18. It's an old style residual network with some skip connections, and you take a bunch of images and you run them through the model and you look at what they look like, okay? I don't think you can make anything of it, right? People are trying their best, it's hard, right? Now, they get even better in transformers, right? Like large number of neurons in the internals. And again, like what all we've done here is like run a bunch of stimuli through the model, and you want to cluster them and see like what they look like. Nothing, garbage, right? And this is the problem. Like this is the problem. Like all of these models that we are playing with right now, they're not interpretable, right? So this has been a problem in computer science. Now let's contrast that to like what I told you about the human brain, right? So you have on one hand the organization of intelligence in brains, which is highly structured. And on the other hand, you have these AI systems that have absolutely no structure. So we know that structure in brains has a functional consequence, right? When you have this kind of structure in brain, it gives you some properties on the representations that you learn, right? People have studied these. So for example, one of them is like the representations that you see in human brains. If you run any kind of statistical analysis on them, you'll find that they are significantly lower dimensional than anything that you see in these things on the right-hand side. Sometimes they're an order of magnitude higher number of dimensions. Okay? Now, we also know that there are other advantages, right? Like something like modular computation. Like if you have a part of the brain that you lose, it's not that you lose one function. So we know that computations are more or less modular, right? The other thing that also we get is some kind of interpretability at the mesoscale, right? Like you can just look at it and look, that looks like a person is looking at a face, for instance. You can tell that very easily if you knew which parts of the brain respond selectively to faces, for example, right? So here we said that, okay, let's do one thing. Let's try to see if we can introduce something like topography within AI systems, okay? And this is work that was led by Mayuk and Menak. Now, if you look at these faces, and they look alike to you, they are, because they literally are twins. So, it's not that you have prosopagnosia, so never mind. They are literally twins, and they're both interested in the same topic. Right, what can I say? All right. Now, this is not actually a very new idea. So, people have wondered like different ways of introducing topography in neural networks. Okay, one strategy has been this strategy called TDAN. There's another strategy which is like you introduce some kind of connections between nearby units. We're going to call that LLCNNs. And then there's a new method which only works in transformers called topoformer, right? All of these methods are pretty bad, to be honest. I mean, we're recording this, so no. All right. Now, on one hand, we have these models that as soon as we induce topography in these AI systems, the performance of these models dropped significantly, right? So you had this really great model doing very well on, say, a language task, and boop, all the performance just drops. Not great. Okay. Now we don't have one method that can work across all famous model architectures. For example, we don't have a method that works across convolutional networks and transformers. We also don't have a method that can work across domains, right? Like vision, language. Now, we don't have a lot of principles in the brain. Topography is one of them, right? So we know that cortex is incredibly well organized. So, okay, so we introduced this new thing. I'm going to call those toponets. And it was just accepted as a spotlight paper in ICLR, which is a computer science conference. And before I tell you about what toponets are, or how we introduce topography, let me just show you how good they are. Okay? Because hopefully that will get you excited to learn about how we are doing this. All right, so the way we're showing you this plot where on the x-axis is what we're going to call smoothness. It's a metric that others have used to estimate the amount of topography in models, okay? So it can go from no smoothness or low smoothness to very high smoothness, which is high topography, right? Now, you can imagine that brain is not doesn't have just one cluster, right? So it's like some intermediate amount of topography in brains, which, by the way, we can also estimate, right? Now, this is how good the baseline models are. If you take an off-the-shelf model from the internet, right, that's how they're not topographic at all, is what I'm trying to show. And then you have these other approaches, which is this TDAN approach and the LLCNN approach. You train them for a very long time. 200 epochs is a lot of training, okay? So you're burning a lot of compute, and that's where we are in terms of topography in neural networks currently, okay? So that's how good we do on the same kind of task. So what we are showing you here are 3 different kinds of toponets, 3 different architectures. one is a ResNet 18. You can see this very nice drop as you can increase topography in the network, and you can characterize the amount of information that you lose. The blue one here is another architecture, which is a ResNet 50, and the blue one here is a vision transformer, which is the transformer-based model, right? The worst model that we have is better than the best models before us, okay? That's how good the toponets are today. Okay, now let's show you the same thing for language. So
Wait, go back to, sorry, I'm a little lost. Do it again.
yeah,
Put it up. Yeah, good. So TopoNet ResNet 18 is performing like ResNet 18 with no topography.
that is right.
So why you say it's better?
It's better than the previous approaches. You mean, are you talking about this form, or what are you
No,
talking
I'm
about?
talking about TopNet Res 18, right there.
That one?
Compared to ResNet 18 over there. It's the same accuracy.
Yeah.
With no topography and some topography.
So
why do you
here's
say
the
it's
comparison
better?
going.
It's better.
So
Sorry?
I'm saying that it is better than previous approaches
Okay.
with equivalent amount of topography. I'm trying to highlight two things, which is that there is going to be an effect of your model performance with topography. That's this Pareto curve that you see here, right? Like if you make something that has only one cluster, of course you're going to lose large performance, right? So that's this part on the right-hand side. And what I'm trying to compare is that at equivalent amounts of topography compared to the previous approaches, because that is something that we could, somebody could just show that we have a better model and have no topography, right? So I want to be careful about that. And we have like some ResNet 50 models that are better than the baseline ResNet 18 models, with equivalent amount of topography as the brain, because we know that the TDAN paper estimated topography in brains.
Got it. So your ground truth is kind of there's topography in brain, and you need
That's
that
right.
topography in these models, and it
Well,
might
I'm
do
going
a
to show
little
you
less
that.
than ResNet 18 without topography, but that's nonsense, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Like you can build these things in without sacrificing model performance, is
fair
what
enough.
I'm trying to say. Right. So now I'm going to do some language model stuff. So on the x-axis here, the same thing, which is amount of topography. Y-axis is another measure of accuracy. It's called BLIMP. That's the previous model. It's called Topoformer. It only works on this model called BERT, which is very small, so we couldn't evaluate it on the BLIMP accuracy. Never mind. Most of the models that we train are really good at even doing like language-related tasks. Okay. All right. So now the question is like, how do these things work? Okay. So hopefully now I've whet your appetite. I mean, you want to know why it works. It turns out that you can take like neuroscientific inspiration from things like early synaptic pruning, right? So what happens early in life is that you have this overabundance of neurons in the brain, and you want to systematically get rid of a few of them, right? And so how we do that is by inducing some kind of like distance-dependent similarity constraints. And we took a very simple idea. So I'm not going to bore you with a lot of math. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So if you have a bunch of weights and you have a bunch of outputs, right? That's what I'm showing. So inputs and outputs and weights in the middle. It's a simple like network. All we want to do is we want to make sure that these weights are as similar to each other as possible. It's a very simple idea, such that you have your outputs that will be very similar to each other, right? Okay, how do we do that? Take a simple trick from, like old school computer vision. This is an idea called Turing patterns, right? If you take your weight matrix and you perform a downsampling and upsampling operation, some of you will look at this and it looks like it's almost like taking a bandpass filter it's like you're taking a blurred version of the weights, and you maximize the cosine similarity. You will make things that are very like repeated, like neurons that are going to be close by, you're going to do the same thing. Okay, so that's the general idea. Now, if you have these toponets, you can do things that you couldn't do before, right? So let's talk about the neuroscience side of it again. You can take these Gabor filters, classic experiments that were run on the primary visual cortex. Okay, you can see how they develop over training. So what's happening is this is an animation that you can see. The models are getting learning on this particular task. They develop some kind of orientation selectivity for these Gabors. You can look at them, right? And they look very much like pinwheel patterns that you might find in the monkey brain or the human brain that you've seen before, right? You can also do this across modalities. right? So the first thing, some of the things that we did now is we train models on vision. We now recently, oh my God, Heather, who is the person who has actually led the development of the auditory cortex models, has developed models for the auditory cortex. And then now we have a bunch of models that we've also developed for language. Thank you. There's a lot other parts of the world. All right. Okay, so what we find now is you can get a large number of, like, pretty much all the topographic signatures that you get in the visual system. Things like pinwheels, which I just showed you. Things like selectivity for faces, bodies, scenes, and other categories. Large-scale organizational biases for things like animacy and size and so on. You can get them within these models directly. Okay? Maybe also numerosity. Like, this is the stuff that, we've been discussing with Stella and Danny and Jared. And we can now evaluate them directly on these AI systems. Right? We can make these maps. Now, you can do this on the auditory cortex as well, and this is a collaboration that we have with Sam, Norman, Higner. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can train models that take in cochlear inputs, and you can get them to train on this particular task. People have done that. Now, what you can do is, because you have induced topography, you can find other patterns here. This white region here is actually a part of the brain a part of the network that we are finding is responds selectively to music, and other parts that we know are responding selectively to things like speech. And there are parts of the high-level auditory cortex that does this kind of stuff, right? Now we are evaluating even some signatures in the early parts of the auditory cortex. Now, there's not a lot known about the topography of the language system, but the few things that we do know in language system is that they have distinct temporal integration windows, right? What does that mean? It means that you have these certain units that will respond to one word, okay? And we call them it's like a power law kind of integration window. We have these other units that will respond more to things like few words and full sentences, right? So we can take one principle and we can apply that broadly or to models from several domains all at once. Things that we could not do before. And now if you go to the AI community and ask them why should we use these models at all, right? And this is the stuff that I'm not showing you today because of time. What ends up happening is that the models that you learn with topography are way more efficient. You can compress these models, you can remove 30% of the weights and see almost no reduction in model performance. You can't drop 1% of the model weights in a typical large language model, right? You get models that are way more interpretable. You can take parts of the network and you can lesion them out, almost like performing lobotomies on these models directly, right? And this is stuff that you could not do before. I mean, you can't just take out one part of the language cortex of a large language model. And these models are also way more resilient, which we show using other methods, right? And have low-dimensional representations, pretty much like brains. Okay, but the point I want to make here is that really it unlocks a new set of abilities that we did not have before, right? One thing that you can do now is you can run experiments directly in AI space. Instead of first taking an off-the-shelf model, mapping them to brains and running stuff, you can pretty much do, electrophysiology. You can move things around in your model space. You can do things like microstimulation and look at the effect on behavior. You can suppress responses that you could not do before, right? We can now draw one-to-one correspondences between these AI models that you get from the internet and brains. The other thing that you can do is now you can take these models and train them directly on human brain responses or human behavior. This is also stuff that we are trying to do right now, is given all the large data that we have out there, we have enough. We actually have a paper on this coming out. It's called a mosaic dataset, where we take 180,000 different samples from the human brain, sufficient to train an AI model directly on these kinds of tasks. And then you can build topography within them and look at the causal effect on at least those behaviors. Now, we can also do experiments that we can't do on humans, right? You can train these models with atypical development. Like you can train models and never seeing a human face and see whether face selectivity is going to work, right? You can do all kinds of experiments that these models, I mean, at least you will get like a normative computational solution or insight into how brains develop. And of course, what we're also doing is we're moving beyond just vision-related tasks and the ones that I told you, like we have agents, navigation, intuitive physics. A number of AI models are now coming out. We are working with computer scientists to see if they can, because they have such limited performance overhead, they are willing to now train models based on these new architectures, right? And it's good for them. Okay, so I think it's time for me to start summarizing this. I really wanted to introduce two broad things, right? One is this idea of the virtual visual cortex, where we are really seeking your help to see if we can break these models, right? We want to make this available for the community. We want to make it very, very easy to use. Upload your stimuli, get predictions, choose a brain area, download, run things. Nothing is stored on our machines. These models are already very good, and I encourage you to use them. And in the second half of this talk, like I really focused on this other thing, which one of the things that we're doing now is toponets. They are higher performing models than all the prior approaches for inducing topography. They are way more resilient. You can get your AI models to become better. They recapitulate topographic signatures in vision and auditory cortex, and even in language. Okay, so this is the high-level summary, right? I've told you about like broadly two strategies. One is this like AI for neuroscience strategy, which is coming up with figuring out what the building blocks of human cognition are and trying to model them really, really well, right? And this other strategy, which is I call that the neuroscience for AI strategy, which is we know so much from neuroscience. Let's see if we can improve our current AI methods. And really, what we want to do is we want to change the emphasis. A lot of emphasis has gone now into like the engineering of these parts. Right? I think we should stop and do some more science, And I think this community, when you have these big models coming out, it's the community that tries to break it. And I think this is the community that will try to run those smart experiments that models will not do very well on. And I think this is really a call to action for all cognitive scientists and psychologists. I mean, let's figure out what's going on with them and figure out what their limits are and understand how to break them. Right, and this is the other strategy that I think of all the time, which is that current AI algorithms must learn from the brain, right? Like we have ceded, I think, some territory to the computer scientists, which I think we should get back. There are all these neuroscientific principles. I mean, I just talked to you about like pruning, and we have other experiments with recall, object files, visual diet, it's stuff that's the bedrock of cognitive neuroscience that I think AI models can learn from. And I think it's a call to action for computational neuroscientists. I mean, we should not call them physicists, right? Like the Nobel Committee does. Jeff Hinton had a tweet a few years back that said that he's a cognitive neuroscientist, actually came up with the origins of AI, right? You look at the whole development, and all of them were trained in neuroscience and computer science. I think we got to do more of that. All right, and I think eventually we'll come up with this big picture. Something that resembles, at least partly, the human brain. Lego pieces are all. Okay, that's that. I would like to thank the lab. So these are all the members, and I think I spoke about most of the stuff that these people did. I wish I could tell you about all the cool stuff that's happening in that part. My collaborators, Nancy and Jim, the Atlanta Vision community, a lot of whom are here, this is nice, and funding sources, and all of you for your time. Thank you.
Great talk. I wanted to follow up on one of the earlier questions here about prediction and explanation.
Yeah.
A lot of amazing prediction that's going on. The explanation part, I think your response was about like its explanation from a cognitive neuroscience perspective. And I'm kind of seeing it, and I'm like, okay, even if you perfectly predict everything about where how FFA and PPA and OPA are all going to light up, that might tell us something about the cognitive neuroscience part, but the part about, like, I guess the cognitive science part, what are the underlying functions and things that are there?
Yeah.
I'm curious as to your thoughts about how that's going to interface, because I can see the prediction part, but the explanation for cognitive theories that I think a lot of us in here are interested in, I don't see that link as well. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, this is actually a longish kind of discussion, but I think we should have it. The first thing I want to say is that explanation is always in the eye of the beholder, right? That's just always the case. So there's actually the answer and the sociology that work hand in hand to give you something that we call an explanation, right? Because if I give you an explanation for how these things work in a mathematically compact way, that's not going to be satisfying, right? To some degree for us, right? You take an input image and I can tell you exactly the series of computations that will give you something that will recapitulate everything that the FFA does. You will not be happy with that because it's, you'll say, oh, there are all these things in the middle that we don't quite follow, right? So let's turn it the other way. So to some extent, I've ceded ground and said, like, look, explanation, the explanation that you can get with running these experiments, right, which is we test of a hypothesis. Does the FFA respond more to inverted faces than upright faces? That was satisfying at some point in time. You can get the same satisfaction coming from a model. What that means is that the structure of the brain can be expressed as a physical entity, right? Which, if you train it on the right kinds of tasks, you can recover. So that's the level of explanation that we have right now. Now, in the future, you might have other questions. Like, you might say, okay, like, does the FFA respond to, like, whatever, the Picasso face more than some Rembrandt face, right? And that's a perfectly fine question. Now, instead of having this enigma of running the experiment on the human brain, like, you have all this period of time where you do not know the answer to that question, right? You can get it right now from a model, but it will not be satisfying. I agree with you. But to that, I say that it was going to immediately help me figure out things that we did not know about, which is, how do I figure out what's happening in a person with prosopagnosia? I can create a prosopagnosia version of these models and test them. I can run this experiment where a person cannot navigate, or a model cannot navigate in that space and evaluate that. And make, like, directly mappable components. So let me try to summarize this argument, right? The summary is as follows according to me. There is a kind of explanation that currently operates in cognitive neuroscience, and I think those explanations can be derived from a model today. Now, you might say, I want a mechanistic explanation, right? That mechanistic explanation we do not have in human cognitive neuroscience because our tools are not great. We do not have that in AI systems right now. It is better than what we have in human neuroscience. We can run, I am creating a digital twin you will be able to run studies that you can't run with humans. So at least I'm giving you something more than what you have today. So given the constraints of the field, I think this is the best we got.
The one quick thing I just say to follow up on that is, I think you're talking a lot about cognitive neuroscience and not a lot about cognitive psychology.
Yeah,
and
fair.
There, I think some people would argue, and we can talk about this later, but I think some people would argue, right, that you do have that stuff in cognitive psychology, and that's where the interface part might be missing.
I think we can develop such tools for cognitive psychology as well. We are not, everything that I told you about today is within the space of cognitive neuroscience, not cognitive psychology. I agree with you on that. But it can be done. So we should do more of that. Yeah.
So, great talk. A lot of what is being done, though, is with respect to the architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought at all, or how much are you doing in terms of potentially manipulating the training data, at least with respect to object recognition, right? Things like simulating early human vision, which goes from low acuity to higher acuity, is really important for getting more human-like, right, ANNs.
Yeah, you're 100% right. So everything that Nick is doing right now is in that sphere. So this is the stuff that I didn't have time to get to today. Is we are working with like figuring out what is the kinds of visual inputs. I mean, this is from like efficient coding perspective, right? Like the explanation that are given today is that you have large battery of naturalistic images and a constraint on your task. Like, look, you can get a lot. Turns out actually architecture doesn't matter very much. Right, because convolution-led transformers, like vastly different architectures, give you like converging to the same ideas. The critical thing that has to be done is actually stimulus manipulation, which a lot of us are not doing. So, a large part of what Nick is doing is on that realm. I do have a point to make about development, which is that I don't think that these models are good models of human development. They are a good model of the human end state, right? Like, because what you and I will call development for these models is like evolution and development. So that's problem number one. The other thing that we don't know is like specific trajectories of humans.
Evolution would have evolved with particular inputs that are different from the training sets they're getting, right?
Fair, but so the other thing that we do not have is data. We don't have. I don't know what the development trajectory of the FFA is over the course of like first 1 year of life. So if I come to you and say that I have a good model of FFA development, the test is going to be on the developmental trajectories of the FFA. Those data do not exist, right? So what we end up doing is saying that, okay, let's train on self-supervised learning objectives. Humans don't see a lot of images, but still evaluate models on the end state, right? And that's a mistake, which is, I think that's a fallacy, like logical fallacy in my mind, but also it is because we don't have data. Like, we don't know we don't know how kids will do on the human tasks. Frank Tong has great work on like early development, like acuity changes and stuff like that. But still, the task was like classification, and we didn't complain about that part though, right? Like, so we know that acuity changes seems to change representation, but I think it's going to be a combination of all of these things. So, but that's the state of the field today, right? I think we'll change that, right? I saw a few other hands, yeah.
So you've introduced these models as models of human vision, but they're more models of object recognition.
Yeah.
Right. So I was wondering, like, what other tasks are you looking at within vision? Are you planning on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, so I mean, you can think of this as like a hierarchy of tasks. Right. The first thing that people tackled was what we're calling core object recognition. The idea is that you take the first 50 milliseconds of visual processing, no feedback. The first, like, you get a stimulus, and what are the transformations of the stimulus to the response pattern then? That's the bunch of the stuff that we focused on today, right? Should we need to expand those? I agree. Which is why I like this Lego metaphor, right? Let's build the first parts. Then we'll see how to combine them. And so we are working on combining them for these high level tasks as well. We're doing some version of visual awareness tasks. In collaboration with people, we are doing some perceptual learning tasks. We are moving to some intuitive physics as well. You have all these models that do like predictive coding and things like that, and seeing like whether we can learn some of these using other more human-like mechanisms. But yeah, you're right. Like even these tasks are limited, but there's a lot of literature already. So I think this field is still very nascent. Right? We are still getting our methods in place right now. Like, that's where we are today. Right? So a lot of, we are doing like this engineering and science together. Yes?
I'm sorry, but because I know so little about AI, so I have kind of like an introductory question to ask. That is, like, in the training process, do you like feed the AI with a lot of like pictures with or like do you let like, what do you feed the AI? Like, do you feed them with pictures or like previous experiment that people done that already have brain data, or like anything else?
So you mean the first half of the talk or the second? If you can clarify that, I'll give you.
First, I would say like
the first one.
The training process.
Yeah. So the first one. So we've tried like different strategies. Most of the data that I showed you was data that you can get like off the shelf. Like, you can go on the internet and download today. Right? So these are models that other people have trained. So the kinds of things that the MEST models that are doing, they're trained both on vision as well as language. So what does that mean? Right, like you want to create a kind of conceptual space that can map across modalities. So a word of a face and the image of a face have to come together, right? So the model that we were talking about has been trained by OpenAI, so God knows what it was trained on. I think 5 billion or so stimuli. But the advantage of this particular strategy is that it builds in robustness, because when you look at a line drawing of a face and an actual image of a face, the textual description is still a face. So both of them will reach the same conclusion, right? Turns out that robustness is important to build a good model of the brain, right? Because brains are robust, right? So they've been trained on billions of samples. When we are evaluating models, we train them on a few hundred samples. We try to be we take the opposite strategy pretty much. Train as less as possible on brain data, just map them, right? So that's the strategy that we've been doing. But it's not, by the way, the other thing I want to say is that it's not as complicated as you think. And I mean, there's enough code out there, and it's all pretty doable. So if you're interested, I mean, if this is a gateway to doing this kind of work, I mean, I think everyone's welcome, right? So there's a lot to contribute.
Okay, so because you also mentioned that there's like a thing that we can also input data and then get the stimulus. And
that one is plug and play. Like you go online. I mean, I'll give you. Actually, maybe there is a thing that's running so we use. I have an old version of this that's running for a course at MIT right now. So if you go on your mobile phone and you do bit.ly, right, /VVTC, you'll be able to play with it. Upload images from your laptop, you'll get a bunch of predictions. That's it. It's as easy as that. So you don't have to do any coding at all. So upload images, you have a question about the FFA, come up with a set of images, get your hypothesis in place and run it. And then plug the data. That's it. As simple as that.
Because I remember there's a list of brain areas that we can do tests on.
Yeah.
Are all of those brain areas that we already
Yeah, so initially that's a good question actually, because we focus on brain areas for whom we have a lot of literature available because of the way we want to evaluate them, right? So there's the other strategy that we're also trying to do, which is just do brute force. It doesn't matter which brain area, just predict the whole brain. We can do that also to some degree. But right now, the brain areas that we've been showing you are all brain areas that a lot of people have studied. So they're relatively well characterized in human cognitive neuroscience.
Okay. Sorry, I have a series of questions.
Yeah, please.
So,
I don't know if you want to take that offline or, if there are more questions.
We will have a reception after if you want to follow
So
up.
maybe
take some more general
can chat
questions.
offline and I can take, if there are any other burning questions for now, or we can do that over reception as well. Everybody's waiting for reception.
Ratan, VVC has topography or not?
No.
But it's doing great.
Mm-hmm.
Would it do greater?
Yeah.
With
It
topography?
does very well actually. With topography.
But your second part was saying how topography was so important.
Yeah. Well, why topography is important? The second half is trying to address the limitations from the first half, honestly. When you're working with those models that we are playing with, we have to do this thing called mapping. You take a neural network, you want to make it something that looks like an FFA. Instead of just taking a neural network here and saying, you are the FFA, right? We can't do that today. With topographic networks, you can.
Okay.
Right? So that's a limitation, right? The other thing that you can do is I can move around in brain space. For example, that the FFA is almost repelled by the PPA, right? You're far away. And then you have the FFA and the FBA relatively close by. Does that all automatically, do you see that already in your topographic network? The answer is yes. Right? Okay, what can we do to engineer it to be close enough? You can run those experiments that we just cannot with the prior approach.
So would really the ultimate goal be putting topography in VVC?
Yes.
Okay. And then second question, dude, and it's I don't have a series. It is on that second one where you impose the spatial constraints.
Yes.
They could have. You're going to get constraints. You impose them.
Yes.
But you got the constraints that the brain has. That's the idea.
That's right. And actually, the the cool thing is not that we did impose something that should give you a topographic space.
It
So
has to.
it has to.
Yeah.
Right? But there are all these emergent phenomena that we did not engineer in,
Okay.
but that we see. Like, for example, the stuff
So
that I was
that
telling
in
you
and
about
of itself
resilience.
is cool, isn't it?
What?
That in and of itself is
That is,
fine, that's cool.
I think it is, thanks. Okay, I'm glad you agree. But I mean, you know, what is, you're right that, you know, there's a tautology in the logic.
It could have
right?
chunked up in all different ways, dude.
Right, but also
it
that-
could have chunked up by color of image. It didn't.
That's right. But the other thing that could have happened is that you could impose topography and not see the same distance-dependent constraints that you're seeing in grains. Like the stuff that I was telling you about, this fact that the FFA and the FBA are close by. Right? But we do see it. Right? So there's some things that it's emerging and other things that we're engineering.
Okay.
So we are trying to dissociate between the two.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a nice, let's give you a break.